But the Stamp Act is repealed, right? So that's something that a lot of people don't realize, because when people think of the revolution, a lot of times we think of overthrowing a monarchy, right? Well, we didn't want a king, we wanted a democracy. All of these laws that are upsetting the colonists are being passed by Parliament. They're not necessarily, very little of this is actually the result of something that the king at the time is George III. He doesn't do very much to create this situation. It's mostly Parliament. And actually, the colonists they write these appeals to the king, like, we're your loyal subjects. Why are you letting Parliament do this to us? You know, they were very proud to be a part of the British Empire, and so the idea that this sort of stuff would lead to Declaration of Independence, for a lot of people, you know, in the 1760s, they did not see that being the situation. They saw that we could reconcile this, we can deal with this is still the best country in Europe for us to be associated with, and they were all mostly of English ancestry, right? Here's a good quotation, actually. This is from a book that, through their use of the English language, their faith in Protestant religious orders, and their adherence to British notions of liberty and justice, they celebrated their place as assimilated subjects of the British Atlantic community. This is another one. This is actually from page 152 of the book, Give Me Liberty. Give Me Liberty, 152. British governments during the first half of the 18th century adopted a policy of salutary neglect, which I think in high school we learned it as benign neglect. I'm not sure how they teach it. Was it benign? Salutary neglect towards the colonies, leaving them largely to govern themselves. That's the main thing, leaving them largely to govern themselves. When that ends, right, you have restraints, right? Remember that thing about the anatomy of revolution? There are restraints put in place. These are all restraints, right? You can't move onto this land. You have to pay these taxes. And then when people are angry over those restraints, you see a response that doesn't handle it well, right? I mean, so the British government repeals the Stamp Act, but then they issue this thing called the Declaratory. There's a lot of acts, you know, we're not doing all of them. The Declaratory Act. They basically say, okay, we're repealing the Stamp Act, but we declare that we have the right to tax colonists. Like, you're our colonial subjects. These are our colonies, and you know, they had a point to a certain extent, right? I mean, as far as protection from the British military and you know, all sorts of stuff, like naval protection, right? And the colonists were not paying nearly as many taxes as people in England were. So on both sides kind of have points. But they declare in this Declaratory Act, after repealing the Stamp Act, we have the right to tax colonists however we want, right? These are our colonies. And so they've ended up passing these things called the Townshend Acts, which are various ways of raising revenue. And also, I think one of them involves the whole concept of, who knows the Quartering Act? Who learned about the Quartering Act? Third Amendment is that troops, sounds really antiquated because it kind of is, but it's important. The troops shall not be quartered in the homes of Americans, right? You don't have to house soldiers. It's basically this fear of an army. Who's ever heard of posse comitatus? This idea that you cannot use the military. It's called the quartering domestically. The Quartering Act. A lot of people misinterpret this act as saying that the British military could kick in the door to your house and say, this soldier needs a place to sleep. He gets your kid's bedroom. The royal governor, the governor appointed by England, had the right to take any buildings that were not being used, like private buildings that the government didn't own, but they were owned by colonists. But if they were vacant at the time, basically to use them to house troops. So it's not like they were coming into your house at dinner time like, his name is Steve, he's a private. You give him a plate and he gets to sleep in your kid's top bunk. Now you have these taxes that are upsetting people. The regulation of trade, right, which Boston is going to be the center of a lot of this revolutionary activity. So you have all of these taxes that are upsetting people, especially around Boston is a city of trade, right? It's a city with a harbor where there's lots of commerce going through it. Up Boston, New York, and then Charleston in South Carolina is really the one southern city that's a big city that ends up being a pretty good sized city and also engaged in trade. So you have all these taxes, all these people engaged in trade. They all live in Boston. They're all getting pissed off. And then you also now have the presence of lots of troops. And also you have a navy, because one of the elements of these various Townshend Acts is that the British Navy actually starts impressing sailors. You hear about this in the War of 1812. It's not like they impressed them like they pulled their boat up what's up? You want to go for a ride on my boat? Yeah, not like that kind of impressing them. Like they would kidnap them basically. They would go take a private vessel, and like people like John Hancock, the guy who signed the Constitution, he's one of the wealthiest people in Massachusetts. But so one of his boats, you know, the British Navy just comes up to it as it's coming into the harbor and takes sailors because they needed people to man their ships. I don't know how you end up with the most powerful navy in the world when all you're doing is just coming up to the side of other ships and going, come on, get on the boat, you're working for us now. Imagine you're John Hancock and you're now all of a sudden you're getting slapped with massive customs fees. Right before you were bringing whatever you wanted into the colonies and there really wasn't regulation, and now every ship you have is getting stopped. And so he and other people take cargo. John Hancock did this with wine once. He had a bunch of wine, and he took all these crates of wine and put it onto smaller ships and had the ships sort of go land in some beach area somewhere, and then showed up. But when the problem is when they show up at the Boston Harbor and the British customs people are there, the ship gets like way higher than it should be because it's lighter, right? Because they just dumped like 75-80% of their cargo, so they would only have to pay like a small amount. And these British customs people are looking at him like, wait, why you went all the way to Europe and back and you got like, why is most of your ship empty? Like, why would you even do that? That doesn't seem like profitable. He's like, no, you know.